us down, Cooter.
1.1, a 1.2, a 1.3. Let's rock!
Hello and welcome to Special Session. I'm your host, Brian Schott. Today on the podcast, we're wrapping up Saturday's Utah GOP Convention. Rob Axson won another term piloting Utah's dominant political party for the next 2 years. He defeated former Representative Phil Lyman. We'll talk about what that means for the future of the Utah GOP. But before we get to that, I want to point out something that really struck me from Saturday. As you know, I am currently suing the Utah legislature because they won't give me a media credential to cover the Utah Capitol, even though I've been reporting on politics here in the state for more than 25 years. It wasn't easy. It took a few discussions, but I was able to secure a press credential from the Utah Republican Party to cover Saturday's convention on the campus of Utah Valley University. So, I'm not considered a journalist by the Utah legislature, which is dominated by Republicans, but I am considered a journalist by the Utah GOP, which is dominated by Republicans. The Utah legislature is a public body. They're funded by taxpayers, and they say I'm not a journalist and want to keep me out. The Utah Republican Party is a private organization. They're funded by donations from their members, and they say I am a journalist. What's the difference? I don't know, but it is quite the juxtaposition, don't you think? Anyway, enough of that. Let's get to breaking down what happened at the Utah Republican Convention on Saturday. Rob Axson won another term as Utah Republican Party chair on Saturday, but it was a lot closer than even I thought it was going to be. He defeated former Representative Phil Lyman by just 125 votes. It should not have been this close. Axson's been extremely effective as the chair of the Utah Republican Party by any measure. Under his guidance, the party has raised hundreds of thousands of dollars, which is a reversal of what we've seen in past election cycles, and that was used to support candidates up and down the ballot, which is something that the party also has not been able to do in recent election cycles. But despite that success, he came really close to being ousted by Lyman. 48% of the delegates who showed up on Saturday voted for Lyman, which could portend some troubles going forward, and we'll get to that in a second. Now, Axson got a last-minute endorsement from President Donald Trump, and he admits that that probably is the reason why he won.
I was very grateful to have earned the support of President Trump. I was grateful to have earned the support of Congressman Kennedy and Congressman Owens and certainly Senator Lee. Turning Point Action focused on young people. Do I think that I could have won on my own? No, I don't. And I don't know what that metric is. But it's all these people in this room. It's a bunch of delegates down there that voted for me. It takes everybody. And that's my vision and my commitment as long as I'm chair of this party, is to not have it be about me. It's not about me. It's about this party and all of us together building.
Axson's win does continue the recent trend among Utah Republican delegates to pick the more pragmatic candidate when it comes to running the party. When they're deciding political offices, the delegates usually go for ideologues, but not so much when it comes to chairman. I think back to 2017. Former chairman James Evans had run the party into the ground financially. They could not pay their bills. They hadn't paid their rent on their headquarters. They had trouble paying for the convention. There was even a moment where they might not have gotten the convention hall. They had rented out the Sandy Convention Center, and because they hadn't paid a bill, they were going to be locked out of the convention. They had to scramble to come up with some money. A lot of those financial problems were because of the party's years-long legal battle to try and overturn SB 54, which created the signature path to the ballot. That fight nearly bankrupted the party. But Evans was ousted in 2017 in favor of Rob Anderson, who had served as the chairman of the Davis County Republican Party. And Anderson immediately got sideways with a small group of hardliners on the party's state central committee, which is the governing body of the party, because he wanted to drop the lawsuit over SB 54. The party was over $400,000 in debt. Big donors were not giving any money to the party anymore because of that legal battle against SB 54. They favored having a signature path to the ballot. So they had cut off funding for the party. $400,000 in debt. They were in a lot of trouble. And Anderson said, we need to stop the lawsuit. Well, that upset this small group of people on the state central committee who wanted to keep it going. And that's when his trouble started. And after 2 years in office, Anderson decided he had had enough and didn't run for another term. In 2019, the delegates selected Derek Brown, who's now the Attorney General, over Phil Wright, who was one of those hardliners on the state central committee who wanted to continue the legal battle against SB 54. A few months earlier, the Supreme Court had turned away the Republican Party's appeal of a lower court ruling, but Wright and his supporters wanted to keep the fight going, try another lawsuit. The delegates picked Brown, who was the more establishment candidate. He was a former staffer for Senator Mike Lee, much like Axson is now, and Lee has broad support among Republican delegates. So they elected Brown, who with Lee's help was able to dig the party out of the financial troubles that they had. There was a little hiccup to that in 2021. Brown decided he was not going to run for party chair for a second term. There was a slate of candidates put together by the former Utah County Party Chair Stuart Pay. He was running with Austin Cox, who was the campaign manager for Governor Spencer Cox. And on the eve of the convention, there was a letter that was sent out to Republican delegates from Governor Cox, Lieutenant Governor Henderson, state leaders, former Speaker of the House Brad Wilson, Senate President Stuart Adams, endorsing this slate of candidates put together by Pay. They had branded themselves Team Utah GOP. And this letter went out to delegates endorsing them. And that backfired spectacularly. Frankly, pissed off a number of delegates who felt that Cox and other establishment Republicans were telling them who to vote for. And they didn't like that. So at the 2021 convention, in an upset, Carson Jorgensen, who had run for Congress against Chris Stewart in the previous election cycle, was elected party chair. Now, they weren't bomb throwers or anti-establishment types, but they were seen as an alternative to this mainstream slate of candidates put together by Pay and endorsed by state leaders. Jorgensen decided that he did not want to run for another term, and Rob Axson was elected without opposition in 2023, and he is the first chairman since James Evans to serve more than one term. He's got some work to do. That close victory over Lyman could spell some trouble going forward. There are a number of Lyman supporters who have been elected to the state central committee. And as we saw with Rob Anderson, they could make Axson's life hell if they wanted to. They like to stir up trouble. They advocate for hardline positions. They are ideologues. And that could complicate Axson's efforts to try and bring in more younger voters, more casual Republicans to the party, which he said is one of the things that he needs to do over the next 2 years. These hardliners on the state central committee, they don't want that. They like having control over the party. They like keeping the party an insular group. So he needs to find a way to build some bridges between Lyman supporters and his supporters. I think he can do it. He's been very competent as a chair over the last 2 years. He's got good political instincts, and he's got the support of Donald Trump and Mike Lee. That's going to help him as he starts his next term. Where does Phil Lyman go from here? It is really hard to wash off the stink of losing in politics. And Lyman has managed to compress several campaign cycles worth of election losses into just 11 months. To recap, he lost the Utah GOP gubernatorial primary to Spencer Cox last June. He followed that up with a third-place finish when he ran for governor as a write-in candidate. He finished third in November. And then he rounded that out by losing to Rob Axson on Saturday in his bid to become the chair of the Utah Republican Party. He's already announced plans that he's going to run for governor again in 2028, but it's really difficult to see how he's going to be able to get voters to take him seriously. Over the past few years, Lyman has aligned himself with political crackpots here in Utah, conspiracy theorists, election deniers, whoever is behind his social media accounts, are bomb throwers who have turned off a lot of the middle ground Republican voters that he's going to need if he has any chance of trying to appeal to a broader audience. And that's the lesson that he should take away from this past year. He's been running his campaign by focusing on a very narrow group of supporters who are with him ride or die, and these people are very inflexible in their views, and that has made it difficult for him to attract more casual voters who don't really know much about him but might have come across his Twitter account or his Facebook page or wherever and have been turned off by what they've seen. One of his chief advisors, supporters in this run for party chair was Sophie Anderson, and she was one of the biggest election deniers in the state, big conspiracy theorist after the 2020 election, claiming that there was fraud in that election. His supporters have a scorched earth approach to politics that does not translate to broad support. It does not scream mainstream appeal. He came really close to winning the Republican Party chair on Saturday, but I know that there were a lot of delegates who showed up simply to vote against Phil. One delegate told me, his quote was, and I thought this was great, "I've had my fill of Phil." But he asked me not to use his name in my story because he was afraid of retribution by Lyman's supporters. That's the kind of reaction that Lyman has caused over the past year or so since he ran for governor and party chair. And he's going to have to find a way to make voters forget about that or take a step back from this aggressive style of politics. The problem for Lyman is he doesn't have much of a platform anymore. He's not in the legislature, he's not party chair, and without that platform, it's going to be very hard for him to attract new supporters. When a candidate wants to rehabilitate their image, they disappear for a while and let the bad news fade into the past. Americans have a very short attention span when it comes to politics. Look at what's happening in the New York mayoral race right now. Andrew Cuomo, who was the governor of New York, left office disgraced because of controversies that surrounded his administration. He's leading the race to become the next mayor of New York City because he faded into the background for a while, and there's a large group of voters who aren't hyper-focused on politics and don't remember this stuff. And frankly, the media loves a good comeback story. So if Lyman can find a way to rehabilitate his image, or if he tries, I suspect he'll find at least some media here in Utah who are willing to help him with that. But it's going to take some time, and it's going to take a concerted effort to try and undo a lot of the damage that he's done to his brand over the past year. I don't know if he can do it. I don't know if his supporters will let him do it. But never say never. Something happened on Saturday at the Republican convention that got my antenna twitching, and there are signs that there's an effort going on in the background of the Republican Party to try and repeal SB 54, which is the 2014 law that allows candidates to gather signatures and bypass the caucus and convention system. Now, delegates hate signature gathering because it dilutes their power. Before there was the path to gather signatures to get on the ballot, it was a small group of delegates who controlled access to the ballot, who could run under the banner of the Utah GOP. There are about 4,000 state-level level delegates in the Utah GOP, and then fewer when you get down to the county level. And before the signature gathering path came along, those delegates had an incredible amount of power, an incredible amount of influence over who would appear on the ballot. And when there's no signature gathering candidates, they have complete power over which Republican candidates advance. Last year, Senator Lincoln Fillmore, he needed just 116 delegate votes at the Salt Lake County Republican Convention to win the party nomination. He was challenged by another convention-only candidate. There was no signature gathering candidate. Got 116 votes. He wins, and then he ran unopposed in November. In a lot of these solidly Republican or even Democratic districts, winning the delegate vote at the party convention is pretty much winning the election in November. Representative Candace Perucci got 68 votes last year at the convention to fend off another convention-only challenger. She did have a Democratic challenger, but Republicans outnumber Democrats in that district almost 5-1. So winning a convention was the hardest part of her re-election race. Let's look at what happened with Representative Ken Ivory last year in House District 39. He got a Republican challenger, Lisa Dean, who collected signatures to get on the primary ballot. If she had not done that, Ivory would have won the Republican nomination at convention outright with just 38 votes from delegates. Without the signature collecting path, Lisa Dean would have been knocked out at convention and Ivory would have cruised to another term. Instead, he was forced into his first ever primary election. He won that fairly easily, but he had never had to face a primary before. I remember seeing him visibly upset at that convention because he was facing a primary election. In the past, all he had to do was appeal to 38 delegates. That's it. That's all he needed. So that's why delegates hate the signature path. Anyway, back to the convention. There was a proposal to change the Republican Party constitution to say that any candidate who collects signatures or tries to collect signatures to get on the ballot would have their membership in the party stripped. They would be kicked out of the party. That would have set up all sorts of problems for the Utah GOP because they would have been in direct conflict with state law. Unexpectedly, at the beginning of the convention, the sponsor of that proposal got up and yanked it off the agenda. He said he wasn't moving forward. And his reasoning was kind of cryptic, where he said he was recently made aware of a better path that was coming forward. And then when Senator Mike Lee got up to introduce Rob Axson, he said something in that speech that really set off alarm bells for me.
Mr. Governor, I ask you to convene a special legislative session as soon as possible. Bring together the legislature and ask the legislature to restore the caucus and convention system. So I call upon all within the sound of my voice. If you agree with me, please express it in any way you can to your state senators, to your state representatives, anyone else who will listen. Let's reinstate the caucus and convention system and tell the state, tell the government, stay out of our nomination process. It doesn't belong to you. Thank you very much.
You could dismiss what Lee said as simple bluster, calling on the governor to convene a special session to repeal SB 54. And perhaps maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I don't think it's a coincidence that the guy who wanted to change the rules of the party to kick signature gathering candidates out abandoned that effort, and then shortly thereafter, you have Senator Mike Lee calling on the governor to bring the legislature into special session to repeal SB 54. After his win, Rob Axson was asked about this, and he noted that there are enough votes in the House to repeal the law. They're still working on the Senate.
I'd like them to repeal that.
But it sounds like that's not on the table.
It is on one side of the legislature. The votes are there in the House. The votes are not there yet in the Senate. But it can't be a vitriolic conversation. It's not threats. It has to be a conversation that's transparent and upfront and collaborative. If we can show the value of what the Republican Party is doing and trying to do and trying to grow and build additional capacity, we make it a lot easier on these elected officials to take the hard votes of repealing SB 54. It's going to take some time. How long or how short that is, I don't know. But what I do know is we have in our ability the opportunity to build a strong party, and that will be a benefit in repealing SB 54 or solving other complex issues.
He said they're still working on getting enough votes in the Senate. If that happens, I think the pressure to call a special session is going to be ramped up significantly on Governor Cox. And here's why. Candidate filing for the 2026 election starts on January 2nd. That's the first day that candidates can file. And if they wait until the 2026 session, which starts later in the month, then they're going to have problems because they will change the rules on candidates who have already started to gather signatures. If they want this to go into effect for the next election cycle, they need to do it before January 2nd. Now, remember, SB 54 was a compromise. There was a group called Count My Vote, and they were pushing a ballot initiative that would have gotten rid of the caucus and convention system for nominating candidates. And we would have gone to a direct primary where all candidates use petitions to get on the primary ballot. Republicans in the legislature saw that this was a problem. There was polling at the time that showed this idea was overwhelmingly supported by a majority of Utahns. Had they been able to get the signatures to get on the ballot, it would have passed. And that's why they created this compromise. And delegates have hated it ever since. And if they were to hold a special session, say in the summer or in the fall sometime, and repeal SB 54, then there would be no signature gathering path for Republican candidates in the 2026 election cycle. And that would put a number of office holders in real trouble because there were people who are in office right now where signature gathering saved their bacon. Representative Blake Moore, who is in leadership for the Republican caucus in Congress, he would have a real tough time winning another term if the signature path goes away. He was defeated at the convention last year, and signature gathering is the only reason why he made it through. I could be making too much of this. I could be connecting dots that aren't there, but it really feels like Utah Republicans have a game plan to try to get rid of the signature gathering path for candidates for the 2026 election. I could be wrong, but this certainly feels like there's something going on. Unsurprisingly, Governor Spencer Cox and Lieutenant Governor Deidre Henderson did not show up for the convention, and who can blame them? Cox was booed by delegates when he showed up to speak at the convention in 2021. He got trounced by Phil Lyman among the delegate vote last year, and this is pretty much the same group of delegates that were present last year. I think it was smart for Cox not to show up because he would have faced another hostile reception. There was a large contingent of Phil Lyman supporters who are still fuming that he defeated Lyman for the party nomination last year. The last thing he needed was more video showing him being booed and shouted down by members of his own party. So it was probably a smart decision on his part to stay away. It was even smarter for Lieutenant Governor Deidre Henderson to skip the convention because, while Phil Lyman supporters do not like Cox, they absolutely loathe Henderson. Lyman has spent much of the last year falsely claiming that Cox was an illegitimate candidate, that the signatures he gathered to appear on the ballot were fraudulent. He doesn't have any evidence for that. He's also claimed without evidence that the machines used to count the ballots in the primary were rigged and that the election was rigged, and that's why Cox won. And he and his supporters directly blame Lieutenant Governor Henderson, who oversees the state's elections, for those perceived sins. For Lyman supporters, Henderson has become a catch-all for government corruption. When they want to talk about government corruption, they usually talk about Lieutenant Governor Henderson. And given how many of them were in the audience on Saturday, if she would have showed up, it would have been like waving steak at a pack of rabid dogs. So why would she want to show up? Whoever it was who advised them to stay away, they made the right choice. Their absence was notable, but politically, it was absolutely the right choice. That's all I got for this week. Before we go, I'd like to remind you to subscribe to this podcast and leave us a rating and review wherever you get your podcast, Apple Podcasts, wherever. That helps new listeners find the show and helps us grow our audience. If you haven't already, remember to sign up for my newsletter. It's at utahpoliticalwatch.news. It's free, but you can also support my work as an independent journalist by becoming a paid subscriber for as little as $5 a month. What I do takes time and resources. This is my full-time job, and I intend to keep doing it as long as I can, but I can't do this for free. I rely on subscribers in order to keep doing what I'm doing. I don't have a billionaire telling me what I can and can't write. I'm not worried every day that some big hedge fund is going to shut me down, but that means I have to rely on listeners, on my audience to help fund what I do. And if you can swing a paid subscription or make a one-time donation to help me keep doing what I'm doing, I would sure appreciate it. You can find that at utahpoliticalwatch.news. Also, if you are a local business or know a business and you'd like to support and sponsor this podcast, let's talk. My email, I've got it linked in the show notes. I'd love to hear from you. Also, if you have any feedback for the show, suggestions, complaints, hate mail, a guest you want to hear from, a topic you'd like me to cover, a question, I'd love to hear from you. Once again, my email is in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back next week. Brian out.